Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Dr. Daniel Gifford is a public historian who focuses on American popular and visual culture, as well as museums in American culture. He received his PhD from George Mason University in 2011. His career spans both academia and public history, including several years with the Smithsonian Institution. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Filson Historical Society and guest curated their 2022 exhibit, Old England on the Ohio, Louisville's Tudor Revival. In addition to his newest book, which much of the content for today's talk comes from, his previous books have explored commemoration of the whaling industry at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition and how holidays and holiday imagery express deep divides at the height of the Progressive Era. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Daniel Gifford.
After that reminder, I'm making sure my phone, yes, is also muted. All right. I wanted to talk today, and I so appreciate the invitation to talk about this new book. But I wanted to kind of take a different approach than maybe you might expect based on the title, which is Benefactors of Posterity, the Founding Era of the Filson Historical Society, 1884 to 1899. Because obviously this book is about the Filson and the beginning of the Filson, what was known as the Filson Club at the time, now Filson Historical Society. But I didn't want to make that the focus, because what was so interesting in writing this book is even though this group, this very early historical society was the center of the story, it kept radiating out. It kept rippling out. Like I dropped a big rock in the middle, and just all these waves kept touching on all of these different topics. And really this became a history of Louisville, the history of Kentucky, a history of the historical profession itself, really a lot of different angles. And that's really what I wanted to kind of focus on today, is give you a sense of what's in this book beyond the Filson Historical Society itself. Now, just a little bit of background before I do that. This is the 140th anniversary of the Filson. It was founded in 1884. And so this project was initiated about 2 years ago. The research was begun in order to commemorate the 140th. And I say commemorate very specifically. This is not a celebration. It's a commemoration of this history and really these first 15 years, this founding era. Again, 1884 to 1899. And what I hope I've accomplished is really provided what I say is a 360-degree look at this organization and its founders. Especially, you'll hear me mention this name quite a bit, Reuben Durrett. He's the gentleman on the cover. And he's really the founding father, the force behind this historical society that propels it during the first 15 years. But, I'm not looking to turn this guy or anyone associated with the Filson Club into heroes. This is really meant to be a look at, all the circumstances and all the contexts and all the successes and failures taken together. And we call this a direct and explicit reckoning with the organization's past. And that was really my mandate when I was asked to start this project and to write this project. The Filson itself really wanted to understand its history, warts and all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so there were no limits on, opening the closets and shaking loose the skeletons. But there are also no limits in the positive surprises and the things that turned out to be quite refreshing and quite surprising in good ways. So again, that idea of a 360-degree look. All right, but like I said, I really want to focus today on some of these stories that come out of the book that are connected to Louisville and Louisville's history. And, they range from everything from the Southern Exposition, which is at the beginning of this era. We may know it today as what created the site for St. James Court and that famous part of Louisville. Our famous park system, our beloved park system that we're very rightly proud of, turns out to have really interesting and really sort of undiscovered roots in this story. The tornado of 1890, one of the most significant natural disaster events in Louisville history. The Filson turned out to be kind of at the center of that as well, which I'll explain. This is the Kentucky building at the Chicago World's Fair. Who's Red Devil in the White City? Okay, so that fair, well, Kentucky had a presence at the fair, and the Filson was right in the middle of all that as well. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And from that, of course, something I think everybody in the room probably recognizes, the famous Daniel Boone statue. Again, surprises came out of the woodwork in researching that as well, precisely because I was looking at it from the question of the founding era of the Filson. So that's really what I'm going to be doing. So what I thought I'd do is go back and forth and talk sort of freeform, but also read some passages from the book so you get a little sense of the style and the flavor. And I'll start with the Southern Exposition. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to go back one. Talk a little bit more broadly about Louisville itself. Why the Filson, why Louisville, why those two things came together in this era, in the era of the Gilded Age. The fact that Nazian historical societies looked not only to the Filson Club, but to Louisville for guidance and inspiration was no accident. Louisville stood out in Kentucky and the entire South for its post-war economic boom, which in turn led to a raft of social and cultural opportunities that were largely unique to the growing metropolis. While much of the state repudiated industrialism and looked to restore an agrarian past, Louisville cast itself as a center of manufacturing, trade, transportation, and finance. The resultant middle and upper middle class citizenry, not to mention more than a handful of newly minted millionaires, organized themselves into charities, societies, clubs, and associations that drove a diverse intellectual life in the city, of which the Filson Club and the Polytechnic Society, which was kind of a precursor umbrella group, were just two examples. Perhaps only Richmond, Virginia rivaled Louisville in the South for this marriage of industry and intellectual communities, a fact that was not lost on historian John Mel Henneman, who wrote in 1893, "While most of the states in the South have nominally historical societies, after Virginia, Kentucky seems especially prominent for having a society which furnishes similar publications. This is the Filson Club of Louisville." So Louisville was on the map to a small audience. We'll talk about, how kind of the limits of that a little bit later. But for some, Louisville had a certain place in the South, a certain connection at this moment of the Gilded Age that made it unique, and thus made the founding of the Filson unique. By the way, when I talk about the Gilded Age, basically that's a kind of catch-all term from the period after the Civil War up until about the turn of the century, which is also when I end the book here. All right, so with that sort of in mind, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this Southern Exposition. The Great Southern Exposition of Art, Industry, and Agriculture, more commonly known by the simpler Southern Exposition, or even more simply, the Southern Expo, was Louisville's attempt to position itself as one of the South's greatest assets. Touting the city's location and commercial interests, the Southern Exposition marked Louisville's deliberate rebranding as the South's gateway to the North, as opposed to the North's southernmost industrial city. The initial run of 100 days over the summer and fall of 1883 was so successful that the exposition repeated annually through 1887, despite competition from the World Cotton Centennial Fair in New Orleans. The 1886 printed program for Southern Expo could not help but tweak the nose of New Orleans while highlighting the exposition's main message. Quote, "The second undertaking at New Orleans started out under far better advantages than the Southern Exposition of 1883, and its unhappy failure simply emphasizes that the position of Louisville and its relation to population, productive areas, commercial needs, and industries of the whole country have securely established Southern Exposition beyond the reach of failure." So quite a bit of boosterism here, quite a bit of pride, justified in many ways, in the fact that Louisville had emerged out of the Civil War and the immediate years after the Civil War as a leader, as an industrial leader, even within the South, even within a part of the country where much had been destroyed, much had been sort of left in rubble. And Louisville was not under that same sort of trajectory. All right, so I mentioned the Daniel Boone statue. So let me just go ahead and read this next little passage. "Perhaps a good place to start is the statue. In a Courier Journal Sunday edition from July 1891, the newspaper ran a piece on Daniel Boone artifacts and where to find them. It was quintessential Sunday newspaper fare, 3.5 columns filled with interesting anecdotes about various supposedly authentic Boone objects and portraits that were scattered throughout the city. Towards the end, the feature turned attention to an artist who was going to cast a bronze statue of Daniel Boone. Reuben Durrett, I mentioned him at the beginning, would be involved so that an accurate representation of Boone's rifle and hunting shirt could be achieved. The statue was also to be displayed at the Kentucky building of the Columbian Exposition, after which it returned to Louisville to be placed in one of the city's parks." Now, proud Louisvillians, many of you here, of course, already know this story thanks to historical markers, books, exhibits, and articles about Enid Yandell, yes, one of the city's artistic heroes. Except the text of the article was not about Yandell. So if you look, so this article I'm talking about is from 1891. The Columbian Exposition is 1893. These images also come from 1891. An ad for a souvenir spoon, and the spoon itself, which actually happens to be in the Filson collection, which was a very fun discovery. But look closely, and it looks nothing like the Daniel Boone statue we know today. Why might that be? Well, because it was another sculptor by the name of Carl Rawl Smith that did the first Daniel Boone statue, at least as far as the idea goes. In a twist that has gone almost entirely unreported in the historical record, Enid Yandell was not the original artist touted for the Daniel Boone bronze. So let me dive into that a little bit more, but maybe just to back up and fill in a couple blanks here. So these are the kinds of things that I was really excited that this book brought me to, these sort of rabbit holes and warrens that led in all over Louisville and Kentucky and all over pieces of American history. Now, the reason we keep bringing up Mr. Durrett, Reuben Durrett, and you can see, in this photo on the cover, this beautiful library. Reuben Durrett was not only one of the founders and the main driver of the Filson Club, he was also the foremost collector in the region and probably in the nation of the history of Kentucky and what was known as the Old West, pioneer history especially. And if you can just get a sense, and we'll have another picture in a few slides here of this library, it was huge. It was exhaustive. Scholars from all over the country came to Louisville in order to use this library. Teddy Roosevelt came to Louisville to use this library. Frederick Turner came to use this library. It was famous throughout the United States, but it also made him the go-to guy when it came to pioneer history, Louisville history, Kentucky history. So the fact that these artists, we now have to say with an S, are coming to Durrett is because precisely he's the one that has these supposed original artifacts, authentic artifacts, and all of the details about Daniel Boone. But it was actually Carl Rawls Smith that got there first. And in the book, there's a whole section about how Rawls Smith, was touted, and how members of the Filson Club went to his studio and looked at the drawings and preliminary sketches, and were pitched on this idea of, hey, let's create a Daniel Boone statue, let's send it to Chicago for the World's Fair, and then we'll bring it back, and it can become a centerpiece in one of our parks. Obviously, that didn't happen. Rawls Smith did participate in the Chicago World's Fair. In fact, he was the one that was commissioned to do this colossal Benjamin Franklin statue flying a kite in front of the electricity building. He had a studio in Chicago in order to do this work. Somewhat humorously, he has to share it with Enid Yandell for a while. in a cozy relationship that was far less than cozy, which is described in the book. But ultimately, this is who we know today. This is who we know got the commission. And from that, Enid Yandell has become very much a hometown hero. In fact, I can show you, she has a hometown hero banner that was commissioned a couple years ago for an anniversary. The Filson itself has done exhibits and other parts of this, and yet somehow this story has gone untold. And I think part of the reason for that is Yandell comes out of this looking rather sharp-elbowed, rather ruthless, rather take no prisoners. In fact, she writes to Reuben Durrett and says, you shouldn't give this commission to Carl because it shouldn't go to anyone who's a foreigner. It should only go to someone who is a Kentuckian. And later, there's another letter that's mentioned in the book where it turns out she has gotten Durrett to promise that he will never lend out his Daniel Boone objects to any other artist so that she can retain a monopoly on Daniel Boone imagery, and that her statue is the only one derived from these supposedly authentic Daniel Boone artifacts. So, not to diminish her artistic abilities, not to diminish her importance, not to diminish the fact that she is a hometown hero. But when I say warts and all, I mean it. I want everyone to really get a complete picture of what was going on, including a little bit of the controversy around the Daniel Boone statue itself. Now, I've mentioned that the first stop for the Daniel Boone statue was the Chicago World's Fair. This is a bird's eye view of the fair. Where we're talking about for the Kentucky building is way over here. You can see it circled. And what the Filson Club did, in addition to the Daniel Boone statue, was they were given charge of the second floor of the Kentucky building. And it was meant to be a museum of Kentucky history and pioneer history. That was the idea. That was what was pitched. From the time Kentucky decided to participate in the fair and start to appropriate money for a Kentucky building, the Filson Club was there from the very beginning. This was a big deal. It, interestingly enough, has a connection back to the Southern Exposition because the beginning of the Filson was rooted in much the same idea on a much smaller scale. In the Southern Expo, the Filson Club had done a tiny little exhibit, basically piggybacking off of something that had been put together by Madison County. But here was a real opportunity. Here was, the big time, right? It's a world stage. It's the Kentucky building. This is going to put the Filson Club on the map. Let's see what happens. But for those who knew Reuben Durrett and the Herculean tasks that he had undertaken, also knew that he was largely disappointed and thoroughly exhausted by this endeavor. In an unsigned letter, quite possibly written by Durrett himself to the Courier-Journal a few days after the Kentucky building dedication, that article did not pull any punches. Quote, Kentucky started out to make both a practical display and a historical display. A committee of the Filson Club, which started out to gather up artifacts of interest for the Kentucky building, has enough available material to make a historical display as interesting as that of Massachusetts. You know, we are putting ourselves, on the front lines and, at the forefront of history and historical documentation and historical presentation, historical memorabilia. The fact that Kentucky did not have such a display was blamed solely on the commissioners, who have given so little encouragement in this work that the people having it in charge, disgusted with the perniciousness displayed, have at times been constrained to abandon it and to leave the Kentucky building in its bare, uninteresting condition. The letter concluded, with a little liberality shown them, they could soon have the upper floors of the Kentucky building transformed into an interesting historical museum. And the author wasn't wrong. Even the head of the commission apologized for the fewness of the portraits in the galleries, saying that after all the earnest soliciting he had done, more had been withheld than forwarded. Yeah, this sometimes happens. Money gets in the way. And I end this paragraph with, Durrett was, to use today's vernacular, over it. He was exhausted. And all the fighting to try to make this prominent history museum at the Chicago World's Fair pretty much came to naught. And what's interesting about this, and why I think it's an interesting story in and of itself, but I think it has more of these ripple effects, is, let's see. So here's Durrett again. This is the one on the cover, and here's another picture where you can see that library. You see just how vast this was. What a great resource. What an amazing collection. You know where it is today? University of Chicago. And one of the really sad parts of this story, right before his death in 1913, Durrett sold this collection off, and the University of Chicago happily, wrote a check, a big check, to the Durrett family. A lot of people have looked at this and sort of wondered, why did he do this? And more than a few historians have suggested that he was fairly bitter about how Kentucky didn't seem to take its history seriously, how the Filson Club never could get a permanent home, could never get a permanent building. They tried lots of different schemes. They tried lots of different options. And there just wasn't interest. They tried to petition the federal government when something was being decommissioned, just to, hey, give it to us. And it never happened. And so, most historians agree that Durrett was pretty disillusioned by this time and was happy to take the money and for his family. I argue in the book that this actually goes back further than anyone's realized, and it goes back to 1893. It goes back to that experience at the Chicago World's Fair, because no one really paid attention to that before. But I think it was hugely instrumental, not only in this trajectory for Louisville history, but the trajectory of the Filson Club itself that lasts all the way 140 years later to today. So I hopefully that gives you a little sense of what I mean by some of these ripples, what I mean by some of these tangents that come out of the founding of a club in 1884, dedicated to history, dedicated to Kentucky history, but touches on lots of different other topics and lots of different other themes. So I'd like to sort of continue in that vein and move on to the parks, Louisville's park system. And especially the main ones that we know, Cherokee, Iroquois, Seneca, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and the parkways between them, and Olmsted and his role in all of this. Again, lots of great histories have already been written about this, as well as books. There's been documentaries on PBS. There's been radio shows and podcasts. This is well-documented territory, except no one has really paid attention to the fact that most of the people involved in the founding of our park system were also founders of the Filson Club. That the two match and mesh and overlay. And that really created an interesting opportunity. Why were these men of this mind? What were the connections between these two? What are the connections we can draw between public parks, which are natural resources, and preservation of history, and what historians do? What is the connection there? And discovering that the Filson had these connections gave opportunities to explore those questions. So these are the 10 founders that came together in 1884. Their names are up there as the original founders of the Filson. Okay, the ones I'm going to talk about are Durrett, Speed, Brown, and Davy, all of which are instrumental in creating Louisville's parks. The fifth name that comes up quite a bit is Andrew Cohen, who is not a founder, but was a Filson Club member, had a lot of overlap. And then, the connection also runs through what is, actually it's still active today, the Salmagundi Club in 1887. For those of you that know a little bit of park history, know that it was a paper presented at the Salmagundi Club that sort of kickstarts this, and then it snowballs from there. But it actually has origins even earlier and even more connected because of the Filson, and that's really what I want to talk about. So I'm going to begin by going back to the Southern Expo, because there was something really interesting that came about when I started asking these questions about, well, what is the connection here? What's the connective tissue? And it has to do with these two men, Thomas Speed and John Mason Brown, and a war memorial that they created in the second year of the Southern Expo. The same year that the Filson was founded, the same year that the Filson did its little history display with Madison County. These two Filson founders also did something in the Southern Expo. And that's what I'll read from now. Speed worked on another project in 1884 for the Southern Exposition, a war memorial. The war memorial, which was largely driven by the work of Speed and John Mason Brown, was an additional history space at the Southern Exposition, in addition to the one the Filson created. Located in the northeast corner of the building, the memorial contained military relics such as guns from the Battle of New Orleans and the Civil War, as well as artifacts from John Brown's raid. There were papers from the Army of the Tennessee, which have never been in the archives in Washington, and a copy of Lee's farewell address. The relics on display are very interesting, wrote the Courier-Journal in August 1884. Many who were but children at the close of the struggle look upon these mementos as tangible evidence of what is otherwise to them only a story. So, again, history is being displayed and history is being explained. History is being presented to this audience coming to the Southern Exposition. Even more interestingly, the memorial was interactive in that it contained a register for Civil War veterans to sign. The War Memorial Department of the Exposition attracts all the soldiers of the Civil War, and the register is rapidly filling up with names that represent nearly every regiment and corps of either army. Throughout that year's run, the Courier-Journal would print lists of the soldiers that had signed the War Memorial Register. And collectively, the lists are an impressive artifact created by hundreds of contributing soldiers, almost always divided roughly equally between Confederate and Union names, as well as representing nearly every state on both sides. Thus, throughout 1884, Thomas Speed was given a first-hand look at the power of public displays. The War Memorial brought issues of commemoration, mourning, remembrance, and reconciliation out of the private sphere and into the public space. The public-facing War Memorial was a gathering place, that worked towards a shared experience that cut across lines of sectionalism, gender, and class. And it was exactly the kind of unifying message that Cowan threaded through his Parks report, that Parks report that kicked off the creation, in which he wrote, quote, "Public parks for the recreation, health, and benefit of the public and free to all forever are recognized as imperative necessities wherever large bodies of people have come together for permanent residence. Public parks," Cowan wrote, "are necessary for the comfort, happiness, and health of the people, regardless of class or worldly circumstances, and should not be dispensed with." Cowan did not emphasize his proposed parks as opportunities for military commemoration. I want to make that clear. But his report is rife with calls for civic pride and public good, aspects that Thomas Speed could point to via his own experience with war memorials and with history, putting history out there for a public audience. Now, again, if you know the story a little bit, what happens after that report comes out, it's picked up by the Courier-Journal, it gets lots of support by basically what were the Chamber of Commerce of the day. And the next step is for the legislation itself to be written. That legislation, the man who wrote the legislation that created our parks was John Mason Brown. He's really the father of the parks, in my opinion, as well as Thomas Speed and Andrew Cowan for getting the process started. But something really tragic happens. Brown dies unexpectedly. Prime of his life, succumbs to an illness and basically is dead within a week. Totally unexpected. And it falls to his brother-in-law, George Davey, who is also on that list of founders, to finish the legislation, which he does. He's the one that gets it across the finish line, gets it through Frankfurt, but he's also the one that has to make some compromises. He's the one that has to make some tweaks, and probably the biggest one is that he has to allow, but it's written into the legislation, that the commissioners, the park commissioners for this new park system, are to be elected. Direct elections. Okay? So keep that in mind. So I'm going to read another passage from the book, going back to the death of John Mason Brown and what follows from that. The Filson Club was equally bereft, and the entire February 1890 meeting was devoted to memorials and Brown's memory. Andrew Cowan was also deeply saddened. He later wrote of his response to that grief in a way that illustrated his perfect understanding of public commemoration and the power of public spaces. Quote, "You will remember that I offered, at a meeting of the Salmagundi Club, to subscribe $1,000 if the club would raise $10,000 to erect a bronze statue of John Mason Brown, author of the Park Act, in the circle where now stands an equestrian statue of General Castleman looking out on Cherokee Park." So the original idea, again, turning over some stones, shaking out some skeletons, was not a Castleman statue. It was a statue to John Mason Brown. And whatever side you want to fall on that controversy, I do have one other tidbit that got turned up in writing this history. And it has to do with that change that Davey had to compromise of direct elections. Andrew Cowan would later write, quote, "The next day Davey returned, very angry, and told me that Colonel Castleman would not consent to have me named for park commissioner, because none but Democrats would get on the ticket." Cowan was a unionist. He fought for the Union, was a Republican, Lincoln Party Republican. And so Castleman had said, none but Democrats could get on the ticket. Cowan continues, "I felt completely relieved. And laughing at Davey's anger, I said, 'Give my compliments and thanks to Castleman.' I had never before heard Castleman's name mentioned in connection with parks. And I'm quite sure that until then, Colonel Castleman had not been conspicuous in anything related to public parks for Louisville." stones unturned and closet skeletons released. All right, I want to turn one final example in the book of how these connections of this little group of this Filson Club impacted not just Louisville history and Kentucky history, but the history of the study of history itself, the history of the historical profession, the idea of what does that mean to preserve history, to preserve Kentucky history or pioneer history or the history of the Old West. So this is actually chapter 9 in the book, and this is how the chapter opens. In the early 2020s, rapid response collecting was enjoying a bit of a moment. Rapid response collecting is a strategy that allows museums to collect in response to major moments in history, so wrote the Museum Association of New York to its membership in 2020. This is not a new collection method, but has increased in recent years as museums work to capture history as it occurs in real time. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London made a big deal out of launching rapid response collecting in 2014, while the Smithsonian Institution grabbed headlines in 2021, such as when Forbes wrote, "How Smithsonian's rapid response teams are documenting U.S. history in real time." When the National Endowment for the Humanities sent its budget justification to Congress in 2023, part of a $1.5 million line item included engaging in collaborative planning efforts to prepare communities for rapid response collecting. And while the Museum Association of New York acknowledged that rapid response was not a new collecting method, even they might have been surprised to learn that it was happening in Louisville in 1890. Writing to the Filson Club membership less than 3 weeks after the city's most devastating tornado in recorded history, Reuben Duritz said this: "Something of the more than hurriedly gotten up and for the time intended newspaper accounts of this calamity is due both to history and to science, and it seems to me that the Filson Club is the proper authority to take up the subject and prepare it for its permanent place in history." Duritz was suggesting a course of action that would have made the Filson Club cutting edge in the 2020s, let alone the close of the 19th century. Duritz's call for members to commit their experiences to paper as soon as possible was just one example of how the Filson Club reached into the community, reached into our community, in order to get people thinking about history and engaged with the past, even the recent past. Today, we often speak of two kinds of history: the academic products of monographs and journal articles written primarily for a scholarly audience, and public history, that is, the public-facing and publicly consumed products created by museums, historical societies, historic sites, documentary film directors, and so on. As many have noted when looking at this particular job field, public history did not achieve recognition as a formal profession until the late 20th century. And yet Duritz and other members of the Filson Club were engaging as public historians in a myriad of ways. In addition to the Louisville Tornado Rapid Response Collecting Initiative, Filson Club members gave public lectures, facilitated historical preservation, contributed to publications for lay audiences, and nurtured historical commemoration and memorialization. Though these activities took place in the 1880s and 1890s, their work looks remarkably modern today. Yet all of these efforts would have likely come as a surprise to many outside of Louisville who never saw the Filson Club as little more than, quote, "a little group of Southern gentlemen," as a Nashville newspaper described the club in its founding year. Writing more than 75 years later, Walter Muir Whitehall still saw the Filson Club as little more than meetings in Duritz's library where a paper was read, an open discussion follows, and the evening concludes pleasantly over crab apple cider and Filson Club cigars. Let me just stop and ask for a minute. So I've been talking about the Filson Club, now the Filson Historical Society. Even if you aren't a member or aren't real familiar with it, I think you can probably gather, a little bit about it based on what I've said. Based on that, and based on the fact that we're talking about 1884 to 1899, how many would assume that the Filson Club was indeed a gentleman's club, that it excluded women? Women were not allowed. How many would say that's true, would have excluded women? How many would assume it excluded Jews? How many would assume it excluded Catholics? This is a time of a lot of anti-Catholic. Wrong in all three. The 10 founders were men, but from the very beginning, from the very first incoming class, women were invited to the Filson Club, and by the last list I have in 1897, a full 25% of the membership were women. There's a lot of instances in the book where I think there's sort of modern, tinted encouragement of women's history again and again. One of the most explosive, one of the most interesting, certainly the one, if I could time travel and go back to Filson Club meetings of this era, was a paper delivered by Rabbi Adolf Moses. Jewish members were part of the Filson Club from the beginning, and not only part, but were active contributors, often with massive fireworks afterwards in terms of the conversation. It was a controversial one, to say the least. And Catholic members as well. The Archbishop of Louisville was one of the first members once membership opened up, as well as many others. Now, unfortunately, I think the assumption that African-American members were excluded absolutely is true. They were excluded, not only excluded, but their history was, very much diminished and distorted. And the book deals with that quite a bit, as well as Native American history. But again, the idea that in some ways this Filson Club could be, exactly what you would expect for a Jim Crow organization, but in other ways could be, very broad-minded, almost progressive, even in Louisville in the 1880s, 1890s, is what I mean by that sort of 360-degree look. So to continue with what's in the book, around the same time, Clifford's Lord Keepers of the Past suggested that the Wisconsin Historical Society was the nation's first great progressive historical society. And the evidence he cited for this praise included museums, sites, markers, centennials, pageants, work with schools, serving the public as well as the scholar. And while the venerable Wisconsin Historical Society deserves all accolades afforded to them, Lord's list sounds suspiciously like the Filson Club over its first 15 years. In a report by the American Historical Association in 1905, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania historical societies were identified as prototypes for private organizations working without official patronage that have attained strength, dignity, and a high degree of usefulness. Louisville's Filson Club was not mentioned. To suggest this was overlooked and underappreciated seems to state the obvious. But Durrett, for one, never wavered in his belief that the Filson Club was doing great work. Returning after the summer break in 1897, Durrett congratulated the members upon the place the club occupied among similar associations throughout the world. And there was some recognition beyond the city limits of Louisville. The Nashville American wrote in 1900, "The Filson Club is an organization which is doing valuable historical work for Kentucky and the Ohio Valley, and we call attention to it in the hope that some such organization may be formed in this city." The Courier-Journal had previously made much the same comparison to the Filson's work. Quote, "If every state in the Union possessed a similar association, organized to collect and preserve state history, the beneficial effect on state life and dignity could not be but discernible, and future historians of this country would find such treasures of Americana ready to their hands as to render their tasks but child's play of selection and compilation." Quoting one scholar of this Gilded Age era, academic historians discounted preservation, commemoration, and museum display as all part and parcel of the same illegitimate impulse. They were too emotional, too feminine, too soft to be equated with scholarship. But Durrett and the Filson Club did not do these things for academic historians or their approval. They did them as opportunities to support and uplift their community, even if it was in imperfect ways. The public of public history, too narrowly defined to be sure, was part of the Filson Club from the beginning. What Durrett and his members could not know was that the era of the amateur historian of independent means and the history-minded organizations that they founded and nurtured was coming to an end. And then that sets up the final chapter of the book, which I think is particularly poignant. So I will leave it at that, but I hopefully have given you a sense of, yes, this is a book about the Filson Club. It's a book about those first 15 years, but it's really much broader than that. And I hope, as you've gathered from the little excerpts that I've read, that this is an interesting history, that it's engaging, that it's surprising, and hopefully enjoyable. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. I know we're recording, so if you can come up to the microphone to ask any questions. If you aren't comfortable with that, I did put up my website, and you're welcome to reach out to me via that as well. But we do have time to take questions. Let's see if there's any takers. While we're waiting on that, just a reminder, the book itself is available for sale. Credit cards are taken. There is a discount today, so good to take advantage of that. The holidays are going to come up before you know it. All those history buffs on your list, this is a good opportunity. And then I'll be sitting over here, and I'm happy to sign any copies as well. So let's go ahead and get into questions.
Mr. Gifford, I enjoyed the lecture. As a current Filson board member, what are your thoughts on the current state of Filson Historical Society? Do you like where it is now as it heads into the future?
Yes, I am happy. I don't think I would have written this book if I weren't, but it was a good opportunity for me to understand just how far the Filson has come, where it is going, and what it can still accomplish. I'll give you a good example of that. So as I was writing this book, the Filson Historical Society, as it's known today, managed to fundraise successfully to create an endowment for an African American history initiative, which is with its own curator and program manager, and the opportunity to begin to not only take what's in the Filson collection currently, but to begin to build it out to have a African American collection worthy of the Historical Society dedicated to the history of the Ohio River Valley. That's incredible to me. But it is also incredible knowing what I know from writing this book. And like I said, there's 2 chapters in here that deal with how African American history was attacked and approached in this era in order to understand just how important that is, that what it is today. And same for our Native American history. The Filson has done incredible work reaching out to Native nations in order to better understand our collection and better to take things that are inappropriate in the collection and return them to the tribes where they should be. That work is taking place today, but it stands out like a bas relief when you read about what was going on in this original era. In fact, that chapter on Native nations, I'd say, is probably one I'm most proud of because it really solves a mystery. It really helps us understand why the Filson was so engaged in Native American history in ways that, were bad history. There's no other way to put it, bad history. And it solves that mystery. I found the smoking gun. And really, for the first time, have been able to put those pieces together. So again, it informs the work happening today. As to where we can go, one of the things that comes out of the book that already has fostered conversations is how collaborative the Filson Club was. It wasn't looking to corner the market on history and keep it to themselves. The Filson Club members and the founders would help anybody that was interested. A lot of the historical societies that created in smaller cities and counties around Kentucky, got help from the Filson Club, willingly, happily. Organizations like the DAR got their starting foundation with help from the Filson Club. And so right from the beginning, there was this very collaborative spirit of reaching out to organizations, reaching out to individuals, really, helping wherever they could. And I think the Filson recognizes that as we, sort of close our 140th year and look ahead to the next 140 years, that's an opportunity to maybe jumpstart and re-engage something that maybe we haven't done as well in recent past. Really build that network up in a way that lifts all the boats. And I think that's going to happen.
Okay. Sir, my question is a bit broader about the Gilded Age in general, inasmuch as it has been suggested that Louisville prospered at a time when the rest of Kentucky was still, if you will, recovering from the ravages of the Civil War and all kinds of other struggles in the United States at that time. Can you tell me a little bit about why? Was it simply the river traffic and things like that? Was it the railroad, the center position of the city that made a difference there as distinct from, say, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Nashville, or any of the others in there, to give us a little bit broader feel?
Sure. So, Louisville looked to, if you had an alien beam down without any context or background, looked like Cincinnati, looked like Indianapolis, looked like St. Louis. It looked like these northern industrial cities. It was a center of trade, manufacturing, commerce. It was a crossroads, both river and rail. But it was a southern city. Yes. And that's what made the difference. It was a city that Southerners could feel comfortable coming to and working with in order to get goods out to the rest of the country without working with those damn Yankees. And it capitalized on that. And you saw from the quote, other cities tried to assume that position: Atlanta, Richmond, New Orleans. But Louisville really claimed, some exaggeration, but some not, that it was unique in its position to do that because it was right at the border, because it was, a stone's throw, well, if you have a really good arm, a stone's throw across the Ohio to the north. And that's what made the difference. That's, and it's funny, I think Louisville could have gone either way. I think it could have, if it had consciously chosen, been more like the northern cities and done that. But I think it understood its uniqueness in southern circles to southern gentlemen and southern traders and continued to play up its southernness. It became the genteel city. It became, the horse racing city. It became, the belle of the South. And, sort of consciously and unconsciously poured itself into that role, into that guise, into that costume, if you will. Sure.
As you know, 15 years ago, Jacob Lee wrote an article published in Ohio Valley History on the founding of the Filson Club and Reuben Durrett and so forth. And one of his major points was that the members in their discussions, frequent conversations, did not deal with the 20 years ago event that would certainly engross historians for maybe forever, the Civil War, because they didn't want anything contentious. And hence they focused on the early history, the settlement, the heroic conquering of the indigenous peoples and so forth. And it occurred to me at one point that possibly what that illustrates, if it's true, and I guess that the main question is, do you agree with that? And also, what were other historical societies in the country? I spent a lot of time in the Wisconsin Historical Society. a state-operated facility rather than the private ones
Right.
that you're mentioning. But perhaps it's the the very presence of contending views that we ought, which maybe those other Wisconsin or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania didn't have too much contending views. But what you had in Louisville with Cowan, Major J.M. Wright, who became Marshal of the U.S. Supreme Court, Republican officers in the Civil War, you had that benefit. And I'd just be interested in your views on that. Thank you.
Chapter 3.
I didn't get that far.
It's exactly this, and I'm so glad you brought this up because it's so important. This has become a founding, and I'll go ahead and call it, founding myth of the Filson that they never talked about the Civil War. And, when I started this project, it seemed like all the evidence was going to bear that out. Of the 10 founders, exactly half were Union, exactly half were Confederate. And you'd think, okay, well, that makes sense. Jacob Lee's article essentially said they sort of created a understood collective amnesia around this. And we're like, well, we're not going to talk about that. We'll talk about pioneer history. We'll talk about these other topics. Turns out not to be entirely true. So chapter 3 is another one of these little myth-busting chapters where it turns out the Civil War was woven into the Filson Club much more than we ever realized. And I do my best to sort of illuminate that. Did they talk about it all the time? Definitely not. And is it conspicuous in terms of, all right, well, they talked about it, but they didn't talk about it a lot, given that it just happened? Yeah. So I think there is still a lot of validity to Jacob Lee's argument that there was, if not an amnesia, certainly the idea that, it didn't need to be dwelled on.
A gentleman's agreement?
A bit, and ladies as well, as we now know, ladies and gentlemen. But I think it goes a little deeper than that. As I said, there was quite a bit of ways that the Civil War was discussed. It came up in multiple ways. It came up in multiple fashions. And when it did, the members involved seemed to be pretty blasé about it. Like, oh yeah, some of my best friends are Confederate when they were Union, or some of my best friends are Union when they were Confederate. That the assumption we have today that, yeah, this would have been really touchy and really dicey to have half and half, really didn't turn out to be necessarily true, that they had already worked through their process. And what I argue is that the Filson Club becomes an additional, to use today's terminology, additional safe space to continue to work through that. That they did talk about it in sort of ways that, had rules, had a structure, had a gentleman's and ladies, agreement, and the idea that it remains convivial, remains respectful. One of the ways the Civil War came up over and over again was actually memorials. And Civil War history was written into the historical record as these veterans of the Civil War passed away. So again, right from that, you have a sort of reverence, a sort of respectfulness around that. And then I get into, the historical profession at the time, and this was not a problem unique to the Filson. It turns out that the American Historical Society, our American Historical Association, AHA, in Washington, D.C., was actually putting out special reports and bulletins around this topic saying, y'all gotta need to get past the Revolutionary War. History doesn't end in 1776. Please open up your history associations to something more than pioneers and revolutionaries. So this was not unique to the Filson. This was something that actually had caught the attention of the historical profession itself as a problem. So, again, it's a complicated chapter. It's a very much a sort of 360-degree chapter that starts with this myth. I mean, when I started this project, if you walked into the Filson Historical Society, into that carriage house with the front desk, there was a display that had a timeline of little little factoids about the Filson. And one of those factoids was, and the Filson Club never talked about the Civil War. Well, that factoid is no longer up on the board. That is yet another thing, that little bit of history that got rewritten. Good, thank you. Well, I think we'll call it at that, and I want to thank you again for coming out again on a rainy November, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the book if you choose to get a copy, and if you do, like I said, I'm happy to sign any copies you have, and if you have further questions, I'll go back to that final slide that you didn't get a chance to ask. You can use the website to find contact information for me. All right, so thank you so much.